Welcome back, truth seekers. What you are about to hear is based on a terrifying local legend, a story whispered in hushed tones online. It centers on an abandoned mansion just outside of town, a place with no nameplate, no address, only whispers. They call it the house that eats people. The most disturbing detail: the activity always begins at exactly 3 o'clock a.m., signaling that the girl in the attic is awake. Follow closely as we explain what happens when the clock strikes 3. A distant piano, a simple C major scale, rises and falls. It falters on the upper octave, repeats, and then continues, each note delivered with a metronomic precision that strips it of all warmth. Outside the window, a light, persistent rain has begun to fall, beading on the thick glass and blurring the world beyond. The air is heavy, carrying the scent of damp earth and expensive floor wax. Hong Kong, 1952. It is a city holding its breath. From the opulent heights of Victoria Peak, the view is a masterpiece of contradictions. The harbour, a slash of grey silk under the afternoon sky, is cluttered with warships, tramp steamers, and sampans. At night, it will glitter, a carpet of captured stars reflecting the new, audacious neon signs that flicker to life in Wan Chai and Central. This is the splendour, the frantic energy of a colonial outpost pouring wealth into the coffers of its masters and its merchants. The paint is fresh on the British banks. The Rolls-Royces are polished to a mirror shine, and the race meets at Happy Valley are dizzying affairs of gin and tonics and high-stakes wagers. But the shadows are long here, clinging to the humidity. This is a city of borrowed time, and everyone knows it. The recent war is a fresh scar, hidden beneath silk cheongsams and starched linen suits. Refugees, families with nothing but the clothes on their backs, and stories of a homeland lost, crowd the tenements in Kowloon. Their presence a quiet, desperate hum beneath the colonial roar. It is a place built on trade, and the most valuable currency is a secret. Every family, especially the wealthy ones, has something to hide, a debt of honour, a link to the triads, a political allegiance that must never be spoken aloud, or a past in Shanghai that was hastily buried. In Hong Kong, face is everything, and the families who live in the gilded mansions on the peak are masters of maintaining it. They are a fortress of reputation, and in 1952, the walls are beginning to feel the strain. The Chen family does not live in Hong Kong. They live above it. Their estate, a sprawling 3-story European-style villa named Golden Hill, is a monument to the power of their name. It is set back from the road, hidden by a high, whitewashed wall crowned with bougainvillea, the bright pink flowers somehow looking garish against the impeccable stone. The gardens are a geometric marvel, tended by 6 full-time gardeners who trim the English-style hedges with terrifying precision, even in the rain. Inside, the house is a cavern of polished rosewood and cool, green-veined marble. The air is always still, the thick carpets and heavy, velvet drapes swallowing all sound. This is the normal of the Chen estate, a suffocating, expensive silence, broken only by the chime of the grandfather clock in the hall, the soft, near-invisible footsteps of the servants, and the distant, mechanical practice of the piano. The house is a cage, and it is gilded in every sense. Vases from dynasties long past sit on tables so polished you can see your reflection. French wallpaper depicts pastoral scenes that are a world away from the humid, teeming jungle outside. But this normal environment is built on a foundation of unspoken rules. One does not run in the halls. One does not speak loudly. One does not ask about the iron-bound door to the 3rd-floor attic, or why father, the formidable patriarch, spends so many evenings locked in his study, the smell of brandy and acrid smoke seeping under the door. The splendour of the house is merely a stage, and every member of the family, every servant, knows their part. To miss a cue is to risk. What? No one is sure, and that, precisely, is the fear that keeps the house in order. If the Chen estate is a stage, then Rosalind, the youngest daughter, is the ghost in the wings. She is Rosalind to her British tutors, but to her family, she is Mei Li Jiao. At 18, she is a creature of quiet corners and overlooked spaces. She does not have her older sister's dazzling, brittle beauty, nor her mother's imperious grace. Rosalind is plain, observant, and silent. She is the ordinary character in this extraordinary play. We find her not in the grand salon, but in the library, a room her family rarely uses. Tucked away at the back of the second floor, the rain, the piano, the ticking clock, they are all just background noise to her. Rosalind sits curled in a heavy, brocaded armchair, her feet tucked beneath her. She is small for her age, and the chair seems to swallow her whole. Her hair is a curtain of simple, dark lacquer, pulled back in a way that is neat, but not fashionable. She wears a simple, pale blue dress, the kind that her mother despairs of, like a schoolgirl. Her mother snips, but Rosalind likes it. It is comfortable. It does not draw attention. In her lap rests a heavy, leather-bound copy of Madame Bovary. Open to a chapter she is slowly, meticulously translating into English. Her purpose, on this day and every day, is simple: to get through her lessons. Her work is her study. Her British tutor, a stern woman named Mrs. Mason, insists that fluency in French and perfect English are the only markers of a truly educated lady. Rosalind doesn't care about being a lady. She just likes the stories. She likes the escape. The words on the page are a secret world, a normal place where people have messy, passionate, real emotions. So unlike the frozen, controlled silence of Golden Hill, her simple purpose is to finish this translation before her tutor arrives at 3. After that, her purpose is to avoid her older sister, Adeline, who will want to talk about a dress for the upcoming governor's ball. And after that, her purpose is to avoid her mother, who will want to correct her posture. Her purpose, in short, is to be left alone. It is the simple, relatable desire of a teenager who feels, acutely, that she does not belong in the very house she has lived in her entire life. This room, this chair, this book, this is her normal. The rain pattering against the window is her companion. She listens. Down the hall, the piano stops abruptly. Mid-scale, a door slams. Rosalind does not look up, but her pencil stills. A moment later, she hears them, voices, from the grand staircase. Her mother, sharp and high. Her father, a low, angry rumble. The words are indistinct, muffled by the carpets and the heavy wood, but the tone is not. It is the sound of a crack forming in the perfect, polished face of the Chen family. This, too, is part of her everyday setup. The distant thunder of her parents' displeasure. She looks down at her book. She wanted to die, but she also wanted to live in Paris. Rosalind Chen, the quiet daughter, does not want to die. She is not so dramatic, but she too would like to see Paris. Or perhaps just the inside of the bookshop in Central, the one her father has forbidden her from visiting. She picks up her pencil. She turns the page. The house and its secrets are a storm she can sense, but her only refuge, her only simple, ordinary purpose, is to pretend she cannot hear the thunder. The rain increases, drumming a little harder against the glass, and Rosalind continues to write. It began as an irritation, nothing more, a persistent itch, localized, just behind the shell of her right ear. Cordia dismissed it. The evening air was humid, the windows left open to catch a breeze that never came. It was, she reasoned, undoubtedly an insect, small unsettling detail. She sat at her vanity, the silver-backed brush heavy in her hand, pulling it through the long, dark sweep of her hair. 100 strokes, a ritual. Her hand paused, fingers drifting to the spot. It wasn't the sharp prickle of a mosquito. It was a low, steady heat, a thrum. Character ignores/rationalizes it. Just a spider, she murmured to the reflection. Her reflection, pale in the gaslight, seemed unconvinced. Audience senses it's a warning. Curiosity finally won. She angled the small tortoiseshell hand mirror, catching her profile in the larger glass, a twist of her neck, a sharp intake of breath. It was not a bite. Small unsettling detail. A bite was a raised, white-crowned bump. This was a stain, a small, irregular blotch, the colour of a fresh bruise mixed with wine, flat against the skin as if painted from within. It was perhaps the size of a shilling. She touched it. The skin was not broken. It was smooth, but unnervingly warm, a tiny, localised fever. She scrubbed at it with a damp cloth, scrubbing until her skin turned raw and angry around it. The mark remained, unchanged, perhaps even a shade darker, as if mocking the effort. Character ignores / rationalises it. A rash, an allergy to the new French soap Edward had bought her. That was it. It had to be. She would wear her hair down, but the next morning, the rash had altered. The single blotch had sent out a feeler, a tiny, thread-like red line that snaked half an inch toward her jawline. It looked less like an irritation and more like a map, a river delta, etched in blood. A cold prickle, wholly separate from the mark's heat, traced its way down her spine. This was when the hiding began. "Cordia, are you quite well?" Edward's voice from the doorway him. She started, her hand flying to her neck, her back rigid. "Fine, just tired." He frowned, his gaze lingering. "You've been quiet." Character ignores, rationalizes it. "Just contemplating the day." She lied, forcing a smile that felt brittle. She turned, keeping the right side of her face angled away from him. A sudden, desperate choreography. "I thought I might wear the blue silk today." Audience senses it's a warning. The lie was too easy. The concealment felt instinctive. She spent 20 minutes arranging a scarf. It was a beautiful piece, cream-coloured silk with a delicate paisley print. She wrapped it high, knotting it just below her chin, letting the fringe drape over her shoulder. It was fashionable, Parisian. It was a lie. Small, unsettling detail. The silk felt abrasive. It snagged on the mark, which now felt different. The skin was no longer smooth. It had taken on a subtle, leathery texture. Character ignores, rationalizes it. She ignored the crawl of revulsion, the sense of wrongness. It was a scarf, a beautiful, concealing scarf. She looked elegant. She looked normal. She wore it to breakfast. She wore it while she inspected the pantry. She wore it all day, her hand straying to the knot, tightening it. The heat beneath the fabric seemed to spread, a slow, radiating warmth that the silk trapped against her skin. It felt like it was breathing. Ha, ha. Just the rustle of the fabric, just the pulse in her own veins. Ha. The dream of darkness that night. The house was a tomb of silence. Edward slept beside her, his breath a steady, reassuring cadence in the dark. Inhale, exhale, a rhythm of safety. Cordia lay awake. The mark throbbed. It was no longer an itch. It was a pulse, a dull, rhythmic beat that didn't match her own heart. Thump, 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 thump. And under it, something else. A new sensation, a pressure building in the room. The silence felt heavy, as if the air had thickened, pressing down on the quilt. Small, unsettling detail. She drifted, pulled under not by sleep, but by exhaustion. The dream was immediate, and it was lightless. It was not a landscape, it was a state. She was encased, trapped. The air was gone, replaced by something dense and suffocating. It smelled of damp earth, of cellars, of something metallic, like old blood. She tried to move. Her limbs were lead. She was bound, not by ropes, but by the darkness itself. It was a physical weight. Ant senses it's a warning. She was not alone. Small, unsettling detail. A sound began. It was not a sound she had ever heard. Yet it felt primordially familiar. It was the sound of breathing, but it was not human. It was impossibly large. A long, slow, wet inhalation that seemed to draw all substance toward it. The sound of a colossal bellows. It was followed by a soft, resonant click, like a great stone settling into mud. Then, the inhalation again. A pause. The pressure built. Click. It was everywhere. It was the sound of the darkness. Character ignores/rationalizes it. It is a dream, she thought, the words tiny and frantic in her mind. The house is settling. The drains. It is the storm. But there was no storm. Ominous implication. She tried to scream. The sound died in her throat, smothered by the pressurized dark. She was paralyzed, forced to listen. The sound vibrated inside her. She felt it resonate with the mark on her neck. The skin there, even in the dream, was on fire. The pulse of the mark synced perfectly, horribly, with the rhythm of the unseen thing. Click. The throb behind her ear answered. Throb. She was terrified. But beneath the terror, something else, a sickening, passive acceptance. As if she were not an intruder in this dark, but a part. As if the breathing was not a threat, but a summons. She pushed against the suffocating wall. Small, unsettling detail. Her hand did not meet stone or soil. It met something else. It was warm, yielding. It felt like flesh. A vast, warm, pulsing wall of it. It inhaled against her palm. She woke with a gasp that tore from her lungs, sitting bolt upright in the bed, trapped while awake. The bedroom was grey with the false dawn. Cold, empty. Edward was already gone, risen early for his ledgers. She was alone. Her body was rigid, drenched in a cold sweat. The silk scarf lay twisted on the floor by the bed, where she must have torn it off in the night. Small, unsettling detail. The silence. The silence of the dream had followed her. The normal morning sounds, the clatter of the milk cart on the cobblestones, the chirping of sparrows, the distant cry of a vendor, were gone. The world outside the window was muted, as if packed in cotton. Character ignores, rationalizes it. It's too early, she whispered. Her voice was a dry croak. It's just early. Audience senses it's a warning. But she knew this was the same heavy, attentive silence from the nightmare. Thump, thump. The pulse behind her ear. Louder now, insistent. She stumbled from the bed, her feet numb on the cold wooden floor. She needed the mirror. She needed to see. She stood before the vanity, her own reflection a ghost, a wraith with wide, dark eyes. Her hand was shaking so badly she could barely grip the hand mirror. She angled it. She looked, and the breath left her body. Small, unsettling detail. It was no longer a red mark. It was not a rash. It was a filigree of darkness. A network of thread-thin black and purple veins spreading from the original blotch, climbing behind her ear into her hairline and snaking down, disappearing beneath the collar of her nightgown. It was intricate. It was diseased. It looked, she thought with a dizzying wave of nausea, like frost spreading on a black window pane, like something growing. Character ignores/rationalizes it. No, the word was a breath. The light. It's the light. A shadow. She grabbed the water pitcher from the washstand, splashing the icy water onto her face, onto her neck. She scrubbed at the mark, her nails scraping, desperate to find clean skin beneath. The water dripped, pinkish, into the basin, but the mark remained, stark, permanent. Audience senses it's a warning. She was staring at her reflection, water dripping from her chin. When she heard it, she froze. It was faint, so faint. She thought she had imagined it. A low, airy hiss, the sound of a slow exhale. It wasn't her. She was holding her breath. It wasn't Edward. He wasn't even on this floor. Small, unsettling detail. It came from the hallway, from the walls, from the floorboards beneath her feet. Character ignores, rationalizes it. The wind, she gasped, backing away from the mirror, her eyes wide, fixed on the bedroom door. The chimney, a draft. But the sound was too rhythmic, too organic. She stood motionless, a statue of terror in the greying room. Her own heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. Thump, thump. The mark on her neck answered, a hot, heavy pulse, perfectly in time with the sound she could not identify. Ah. Pause. The house was silent. Throb. Audience senses it's a warning. The sound came again, this time seeming to finish. A soft, wet click. It sounded like it came from the landing, just outside her door. Cordia pressed her back against the cold wall of the bedroom, her hand over her mouth, stifling the scream that was building in her chest. She was awake. She was completely, terribly awake. The house took another slow, deep breath, and the stain on her skin throbbed. A hot, welcoming reply. The formula of rising tension is not always about a ghost in the hallway. Sometimes, the strange, repeating event is the sound of a monk's bell. The intensity is the scrape of a coffin lid you are not inside. And the one who notices, the one no one believes, is the person who is supposed to be dead. For Cordia, the horror began not with a shadow, but with a word. Discovered. It was a sickness, but not one of the body. It was a sickness of the heart. A love deemed toxic to the family's immaculate name. The discovery was not made by a doctor, but by her elder sister, Irene, whose eyes missed nothing and forgave less. He is no one, Irene had said. Her voice as thin and cold as a garrote wire. She held the small carved wooden bird, a gift from him, between her thumb and forefinger as if it were a diseased rat. He is everything to me, Cordia retorted, her chin high, though a tremor of fear had already begun in her stomach. Then you have nothing. Their father was summoned. He did not yell. He did not raise a hand. He simply looked at Cordia with a profound, terrifying disappointment. It was the look of a man appraising a prized vase that had developed a fatal crack. It was, he calculated, no longer fit for display. It would have to be removed. The shame, he whispered, the word hanging in the air-conditioned chill of his study. It will poison us all. The engagement to the Tan family. Ruined. Irene's future. Compromised. Father, please, Cordia begged, the strength draining from her. I will never see him again. I swear it. It is not about seeing him, her father said, turning to look out the window at his perfect manicured garden. It is about what has been discovered, a flaw in the bloodline. It must be corrected. That night, she wasn't taken to a hospital. She was taken to the cellar. The decision behind closed doors. Cordia wasn't privy to the details of the meeting. She was, by then, locked in the windowless storage room beneath the kitchen, a place that smelled of damp earth, old wine, and insecticide, her prison. But she heard the muffled, urgent murmurs from the family meeting room directly above her head. First, there was the low, steady rumble of her father's voice, laying out the situation like a business problem. It was not a discussion, it was a verdict. Then, the sharp, anxious protests of her mother, quickly silenced, and finally, Irene's cool, pragmatic tones, agreeing, finalizing, planning, a sudden fever, a virulent, unnamed infection, so fast. Irene's voice, filtering through the floorboards, tragic, but contained. The doctors, helpless. Her father's voice, contained. That's what she was, a contamination, Cordia beat her fists against the solid oak door until her knuckles were raw and bloody. No one came. The decision had been made. The next sound she heard was the scraping of heavy furniture in the grand hall above. They were preparing for guests. Funeral above, prison below. The day of the funeral began with a sound. Ting. A small clear bell. It was the monk, arriving for the rites. Ting. Cordia sat bolt upright on the cold concrete floor. Dust motes danced in the single sliver of light from under the door. Ting. It was a repeating, rhythmic sound that marked the start of her official erasure. Muffled footsteps followed, the sound of many shoes on the polished teak floors above. Then came the orchestrated sound of grief, the low, formal sobbing of professional mourners, punctuated by the more authentic, tissue-muffled sniffles of distant relatives. She was alive, breathing in the smell of mildew, while 20 feet above her, people were mourning her death. The surreality of it was a physical weight, pressing the air from her lungs. The chanting began, a low, droning hum that vibrated through the floor and into her bones. It was a sound meant to soothe the dead, but for Cordia, it was the sound of her burial. She covered her ears, but she couldn't escape it. The sound was the house. Then, a voice cut through the drone. Her father's. "My daughter, Cordia." His voice was thick, expertly calibrated with a grief that sounded, even to her, almost real. She was a light. So pure, so fragile. Cordia pressed her ear to the ceiling, the concrete cold against her cheek. Liar, liar. A sudden sickness took her from us, swiftly, mercilessly. He was building the story, cementing the lie that would protect his honor. He was painting her as a tragic victim, a flawless porcelain doll who had simply broken. He was not burying a daughter. He was burying a mistake. The true performance began when Irene took the floor. A sharp, piercing wail sliced through the air. "Cordia! Cordia! My sister! My darling sister! How could you leave me?" The fakery was so profound, so audacious. It shattered Cordia's shock and ignited a white-hot core of rage. This wasn't grief. It was triumph. Irene, the perfect daughter, was finally, permanently, the only daughter. "I'm not gone!" Cordia screamed, her voice a raw, animalistic howl. She jumped to her feet and grabbed a forgotten wooden crate. Hurling it against the ceiling, it hit with a dull, heavy thud. Above, the funeral paused. A single, shocked second of silence. Cordia gasped, her heart hammering. "They heard me. They heard me." She heard a muffled "What was?" from an unknown guest. Then, Irene's voice, louder, more hysterical, drowning out all else. "Oh, the pain! It's too much! I feel her! She's falling!" It was a grotesque masterpiece of improvisation. Irene had taken the sound, the proof of Cordia, and twisted it into a performance of sisterly connection to the afterlife. She was gaslighting the entire room. The chanting and the fake crying swelled instantly, a conspiracy of sound to cover the truth. The monk, perhaps paid for his discretion, raised the volume of his sutras. The professional mourners wailed louder. It was the climax, the sound of manufactured grief, the rhythmic prayers for the dead, all blending into a wall of noise. "I'm here!" Cordia shrieked, banging on the ceiling with both fists. "I'm alive! Don't listen to them! I'm here!" But her voice was swallowed. Her prison was soundproofed by their lies. The repeating chants, the repeating sobs, the performance of her death. It was all designed to erase the sound of her life. Her pounding was just an echo, interpreted by the mourners as the house settling, or perhaps a spirit's restless versumas. No one looked down. No one questioned the family's flawless grief. No one believed anything other than the story they were being told. Cordia's screams devolved into choked sobs. She slid down the wall, her knuckles raw, her throat burning. Above her, the eulogies finished. The final prayers were said. She heard the scrape of the empty coffin being lifted. She heard the procession of feet moving toward the door, carrying the wooden box that held only silks and her name. The sounds faded. The guests left. The monks departed, one by one. The lights in the house above her went out. The house grew silent. But this was not the silence of peace. It was the thick, suffocating silence of a tomb. The tension did not break. It simply settled, becoming as permanent and as cold as the concrete floor. The funeral was over. Her burial had just begun. She was alone in the dark, her own heavy, ragged breathing the only proof that she still existed at all. The formula of rising tension is not always about a ghost in the hallway. Sometimes, the strange, repeating event is the sound of a monk's bell. The intensity is the scrape of a coffin lid you are not inside, and the one who notices, the one no one believes, is the person who is supposed to be dead. For Cordia, the horror began not with a shadow, but with a word. It was a sickness, but not one of the body. It was a sickness of the heart, a love deemed toxic to the family's immaculate name. The discovery was not made by a doctor, but by her elder sister, Irene, whose eyes missed nothing and forgave less. "He is no one," Irene had said, her voice as thin and cold as a garrote wire. She held the small carved wooden bird, a gift from him, between her thumb and forefinger as if it were a diseased rat. "He is everything to me," Cordia retorted, her chin high, though a tremor of fear had already begun in her stomach. "Then you have nothing." Their father was summoned. He did not yell. He did not raise a hand. He simply looked at Cordia with a profound, terrifying disappointment. It was the look of a man appraising a prized vase that had developed a fatal crack. It was, he calculated, no longer fit for display. It would have to be removed. "The shame," he whispered, the word hanging in the air-conditioned chill of his study. "It will poison us all. The engagement to the Tan family. Ruined. Irene's future. Compromised. Father, please," Cordia begged, the strength draining from her. "I will never see him again. I swear it." "It is not about seeing him," her father said, turning to look out the window at his perfect manicured garden. "It is about what has been discovered, a flaw in the bloodline. It must be corrected." That night, she wasn't taken to a hospital. She was taken to the cellar. Cordia wasn't privy to the details of the meeting. She was, by then, locked in the windowless storage room beneath the kitchen, a place that smelled of damp earth, old wine, and insecticide. Her prison. But she heard the muffled, urgent murmurs from the family meeting room directly above her head. First, there was the low, steady rumble of her father's voice, laying out the situation like a business problem. It was not a discussion, it was a verdict. Then, the sharp, anxious protests of her mother, quickly silenced, and finally, Irene's cool, pragmatic tones, agreeing, finalizing, planning. A sudden fever, a virulent, unnamed infection so fast. Irene's voice, filtering through the floorboards. Tragic, but contained. The doctors, helpless. Her father's voice, contained. That's what she was. A contamination. Cordia beat her fists against the solid oak door until her knuckles were raw and bloody. No one came. The decision had been made. The next sound she heard was the scraping of heavy furniture in the grand hall above. They were preparing for guests. The day of the funeral began with a sound. Ting. A small, clear bell. It was the monk, arriving for the rites. Ting. Cordia sat bolt upright on the cold concrete floor. Dust motes danced in the single sliver of light from under the door. Ting. It was a repeating, rhythmic sound that marked the start of her official erasure. Muffled footsteps followed, the sound of many shoes on the polished teak floors above. Then came the orchestrated sound of grief, the low, formal sobbing of professional mourners, punctuated by the more authentic, tissue-muffled sniffles of distant relatives. She was alive, breathing in the smell of mildew, while 20 feet above her, people were mourning her death. The surreality of it was a physical weight, pressing the air from her lungs. The chanting began, a low, droning hum that vibrated through the floor and into her bones. It was a sound meant to soothe the dead, but for Cordia, it was the sound of her burial. She covered her ears, but she couldn't escape it. The sound was the house. Then, a voice cut through the drone. Her father's. My daughter, Cordia. His voice was thick, expertly calibrated with a grief that sounded, even to her, almost real. She was a light, so pure, so fragile. Cordia pressed her ear to the ceiling, the concrete cold against her cheek. Liar, liar. A sudden sickness took her from us, swiftly, mercilessly. He was building the story, cementing the lie that would protect his honor. He was painting her as a tragic victim, a flawless porcelain doll who had simply broken. He was not burying a daughter, he was burying a mistake. The true performance began when Irene took the floor. A sharp, piercing wail sliced through the air. Cordia! Cordia! My sister! My darling sister! How could you leave me? The fakery was so profound, so audacious. It shattered Cordia's shock and ignited a white-hot core of rage. This wasn't grief, it was triumph. Irene, the perfect daughter, was finally, permanently, the only daughter. I'm not gone! Cordia screamed, her voice a raw, animalistic howl. She jumped to her feet and grabbed a forgotten wooden crate. Hurling it against the ceiling, it hit with a dull, heavy thud above. The funeral paused, a single, shocked second of silence. Cordia gasped, her heart hammering. They heard me. They heard me. She heard a muffled, "What was?" from an unknown guest. Then, Irene's voice, louder, more hysterical, drowning out all else. Oh, the pain! It's too much! I feel her! She's falling! It was a grotesque masterpiece of improvisation. Irene had taken the sound, the proof of Cordia, and twisted it into a performance of sisterly connection to the afterlife. She was gaslighting the entire room. The chanting and the fake crying swelled instantly, a conspiracy of sound to cover the truth. The monk, perhaps paid for his discretion, raised the volume of his sutras. The professional mourners wailed louder. It was the climax, the sound of manufactured grief, the rhythmic prayers for the dead, all blending into a wall of noise. I'm here! Cordia shrieked, banging on the ceiling with both fists. I'm alive! Don't listen to them! I'm here! But her voice was swallowed. Her prison was soundproofed by their lies, the repeating chants, the repeating sobs, the performance of her death. It was all designed to erase the sound of her life. Her pounding was just an echo, interpreted by the mourners as the house settling, or perhaps a spirit's restless farewell. No one looked down. No one questioned the family's flawless grief. No one believed anything other than the story they were being told. Cordia's screams devolved into choked sobs. She slid down the wall, her knuckles raw, her throat burning. Above her, the eulogies finished. The final prayers were said. She heard the scrape of the empty coffin being lifted. She heard the procession of feet moving toward the door, carrying the wooden box that held only silks and her name. The sounds faded. The guests left. The monks departed, one by one. The lights in the house above her went out. The house grew silent. But this was not the silence of peace. It was the thick, suffocating silence of a tomb. The tension did not break. It simply settled, becoming as permanent and as cold as the concrete floor. The funeral was over. Her burial had just begun. She was alone in the dark, her own heavy, ragged breathing the only proof that she still existed at all. Time did not pass here. It rotted. It sloughed off in flakes of lead paint and fell to the floor, where it joined the grey, felted dust. It seeped from the walls in patches of creeping velvet black mould. It gathered in the corners as a smell, the scent of a wet woolen coat left for a decade in a dark cupboard. And Irene, she was the stone at the bottom of this stagnant pool. The cold here was not a temperature, it was a presence. It was a heavy sheet laid over her, pressing the breath from her lungs and the colour from her skin. Her world had shrunk to the dimensions of this room, to the four walls that were not protectors, but coffin lids. This was the lullaby of decay, and she had forgotten the words to any other song. The music was minimalist, a single, patient note, repeated, plip, a pause, just long enough to build a terrible, silent tension. Plip. It was the metronome of her unravelling, a single drop of water, fat and heavy, falling from a pipe joint in the ceiling to a specific stained tile on the floor. It was the only clock she had. She had tried to stop it, stuffing rags into the joint, but the water always found its way, relentless. Now, she simply listened. Plip. She lay on the thin mattress, her bones ached by the cold floor beneath. She did not sleep, she observed, counting the cracks. Her eyes traced the continent on the ceiling, a great, sprawling crack that began near the water stain and branched out in 1,000 tiny, fractured deltas. It was a map of her own mind. She knew every tributary, every hairline fissure. That one, she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. Looks like a bird, a dead one. Her audience, a small dark-shelled cockroach, paused by the leg of the rusted iron bed. It twitched its antennae. Sensing the vibration of her voice, she called it Martin. It was brave for a cockroach, or perhaps it, too, had nowhere else to be. He won't come back. Martin, she murmured. The sound was barely a breath, lost in the cold air. They don't come back here. This room, it holds things. It doesn't let them go. Martin scuttled a few inches closer, a brittle, scraping sound that set her teeth on edge. Do you know how many tiles there are? She asked the insect. 117. But that one, she pointed a thin, pale finger, is broken. So is it still one, or is it two? It keeps me awake. The not knowing. Plip. The world answered. One drop. One moment. One. She had counted the cracks. She had counted the tiles. She had counted the heartbeats between the drips. 1, 2, 3, 4, fum. Plip. 1, 2, 3, 4, fum. Plip. It was a rhythm, a ritual. It was the only thing that kept the deeper, darker silence at bay, the silence behind the walls. She closed her eyes, letting the cold seep into her. The room was a cradle, rocking her slowly into nothing, a cold, damp cradle. The lullaby was working. She was drifting. The knocking begins. It was the plip that broke the spell. No, it was the lack of it. She had been counting. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Silence. She waited. 6, 7, 8. Her heart, a cold bird in her ribs, gave a painful flutter. The drip had never missed, not once. She held her breath. Tap. It was not the drip. The drip was wet. Heavy. A plip. This was dry. Hard. A single, sharp tap, like a fingernail on wood. But there was no wood. Only plaster and rot. Irene's eyes snapped open. The room was as it was. The grey light of a perpetual, sunless dusk. The map of cracks. The smell of old rain and older secrets. Martin, the cockroach, had vanished. He was the smart one. She sat up, the thin blanket pooling around her waist. Hello? Her voice was a crack thing. The silence that answered was profound. It was an active, listening silence. She could feel the room holding its breath with her. She waited. 1 minute, 10, an hour. Time was meaningless. She began to believe she had imagined it. It was the cold. It was the hunger. Her mind, like the plaster, was cracking. She was imagining a sound to fill the void left by the drip. She lay back down, pulling the blanket to her chin. She squeezed her eyes shut. Go to sleep. It's a dream. This is all a dream. Tap, tap. Clearer now. Not a question, a statement. It was coming from the wall, the one her bed was pressed against. A cold dread, sharper than the room's ambient chill, pricked its way up her spine. Tap, tap, tap. It was a rhythm, a pattern. Someone was knocking. She pushed herself away from the wall, scrambling backward on the mattress until her back hit the cold, opposing wall. She was powerless, a moth pinned to a board, character powerless or endangered. The knocking was not loud. It did not need to be. It was precise. It was inside. It was not someone at the door. It was someone in the next room. But there was no next room. This was the end of the hall, the forgotten room, the one at the end. The knocking continued, patient as the water, but with a hard, dry intent. It was the sound of a knuckle on plaster, a dead, flat sound that had no echo. It was terrifying. Vivid, shocking description, sound, tap, tap, tap. Pause, tap, tap, tap. She covered her ears, but it made no difference. She could feel the vibration through the floor, through the mattress, through the bones of her own skull. It wanted in, or it wanted her to know it was already there. Voices from the walls. Then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The silence that rushed in was worse. It was heavy, accusatory. The plip of the water drop did not return. The room was dead. Irene stayed frozen, her hands over her ears, her eyes wide in the gloom, staring at the spot on the wall. The plaster was greasy. It shined, just slightly, with a dampness that was not from the drip. Vivid, shocking description, appearance. And from that greasy patch of wall, a new sound began. It was not a knock. It was a shush, a long, drawn-out shh, like dry leaves skittering over pavement, like sand pouring from a broken hourglass. Irene lowered her hands. She strained to hear. It was a whisper. At first, it was just a sound, a sibilance, the sound of the rot itself finding a voice. But it grew. It was not one voice. It was many. Full ghost. Manifestation. Auditory. It was a tangle of whispers, a cold, dry chorus. They were not shouting. They were insisting. They were the voices of every forgotten thing, the voices of the paint flakes and the dead insects in the windowsills, the voices of the dust. Cold. So long. Forgot. Nobody looks. Let me. No. Here. Always here. The words were not clear. They were fragments. The feeling of words pressed into her mind. They were not speaking to her. They were speaking around her, as if she were just another piece of furniture, another crack in the wall. She pressed her ear against the opposite wall, the one that was not whispering, but it was no use. The sound was not in the wall anymore. It was in the room. It was in her head. The whispers swirled, rising and falling in a dreadful and minimalist symphony. They spoke of stillness. They spoke of damp. They spoke, stop, of the slow, patient, unending process of unbecoming. This was the true disintegration of the spirit. It was not a violent tearing, but a slow, cold, methodical dissolving. The cold in the room intensified, dropping to a level that was unnatural. She could see her breath, a small, white plume in the air. The plume was caught by an unseen draft and torn apart, scattering, just like her thoughts, just like herself. She didn't scream. The lullaby was too strong. She sat in the center of the room, a forgotten doll in a forgotten house. The knocking had been a call. The whispers were the reply. They were the sound of the forgotten room, singing its one and only song. And Irene, with her eyes wide and tracing the cracks she could no longer see in the dark, finally began to hum along. The cold was absolute. It was no longer a physical sensation, but a state of being. The girl, the one who had cried and bled and prayed for an end, was hollowed out. The darkness of the cell was no longer an external pressure. It had seeped inside, filling the spaces where her hope had been. She had been a victim for so long that the identity had calcified, becoming a brittle shell. And now, that shell was beginning to crack. It did not begin with a sound. It began as a vibration in her bones, a resonance that matched the thrum of her own terror. Then, the whispers came. At first, she thought it was madness, the aural-visual hallucinations of a mind starved and broken. The sounds were the skittering of rats, the drip of water, the settling of ancient, rotting wood. But the whispers grew, separating from the background noise. They did not come from the corners of the room. They came from the stone itself, from the damp earth, from the very air she was breathing. They were the forgotten, the voices of those who had been here before, the ones who had not escaped, the ones who had died in this same cold, this same dark, their last breath a rattling sigh of injustice. They spoke of betrayal, of pain, of rage left to curdle for decades, stole the light from my eyes, left me in the ground. He did, left me while I was still breathing. They never looked for me. The girl, huddled and shaking, had no strength left to fight them. The terror of the living had exhausted her. The dead, she found, were just sad. Their rage was cold, not hot. It was the icy burn of a starless night. She stopped whimpering. She stopped praying to gods who were not listening. She turned her ear to the wall and, for the first time, she listened. Her pain recognized theirs. Their loneliness recognized hers. They were a multitude, a chorus of the lost, and they sensed a vessel. They sensed a living, breathing thing that was close enough to their own state, close enough to death, to hear them. They offered her nothing, no warmth, no comfort, no salvation. They offered only an exchange. You are empty, they hissed, 1,000 voices as one. We are full. Let us in. The girl's throat was too dry to speak, her lips cracked and bloody, but in the cathedral of her ravaged mind, she gave her assent. It was not a word. It was a capitulation. It was the final, shuddering release of a person who had held on for too long. Yes, she thought, take it. Take all of it. Just make the fear stop. The cold inside her intensified, flash freezing the last of her humanity. The whispers did not stop. They simply moved, flooding from the stone walls into the channels of her veins. They became her thoughts, her memories, the sun on her face, her mother's song, the taste of fresh bread, were washed away, submerged under the tide of their memories. She remembered the bite of a rope, the sharp metallic taste of a blade, the crushing weight of earth. She was no longer alone. She was a legion. The pact was sealed not in blood, but in agony shared. The victim was dying. Something else was taking its place. Time ceased to have meaning. It was an ocean, and she was the seabed. When she finally moved, it was not a decision. It was a current. The combined will of the forgotten pushed her. Her limbs, once heavy with exhaustion, felt light, disconnected, like a marionette's. She rose to her feet. The movement was fluid, silent. The girl who had lived here would have stumbled, her joints aching. This new creature did not. In the corner of her cell, a recent rain had forced a small, stagnant puddle onto the stone floor. It was perhaps 3 inches wide, filmed with grime, but in the oppressive dark, it held the only light, a faint, ghostly luminescence that filtered down from some unseen crack high above. She was drawn to it. The last vestige of the girl, the human part, had a single, desperate need to see if she was still there, to see the face of the survivor. She knelt. The stone was like ice, but she registered it only as information, not as discomfort. The tone of her existence was now lang, cold. She leaned over the tiny, polluted mirror. Her breath did not fog its surface. She felt the muscles in her face pull. A tense tightness that was not her own. Her movements were calm, slow, deliberate, as if she was learning how to use this body for the first time. She looked and saw nothing. Not nothing. She saw a shape, an outline, but it was not her. The face staring back from the puddle was a blurred composite, the features shifting like smoke. The eyes were not hers. They were two hollows, voids that held the collective dark of every soul now inside her. The skin was the colour of whey, of bone, of things left too long underground. This was the consequence. She searched for the girl. She searched for the terror, the grief, the spark of her that had defined her existence. There was nothing, only a profound, abysmal stillness, a supernatural will. She did not cry. She did not scream. The victim was dead. The victim would have recoiled from that image. The Marai simply observed. So, the chorus in her head whispered, "This is what we are." She finally understood. She had not been saved. She had been repurposed. The lock on her cell door was thick, iron, and rusted. It had been the absolute barrier between her and the world. The girl had thrown herself against that door until her shoulders were a mass of bruises. The Marai, the becoming, simply placed her hand on the wood. The whispers in her mind focused, becoming a single, sharp point of ice. She did not push, she willed. The iron groaned, not from force, but from a cold that surpassed metal's tolerance. The rust flaked away, and the mechanism inside shattered, the tumblers falling like loose teeth. The door swung open with a sigh. She stepped out into the corridor. It was not an escape, it was a release. She was no longer prey fleeing a trap. She was the trap itself. Now mobile, she walked. Past the room where her tormentor slept, his breath a foul, snoring cadence. The girl would have run. The girl would have sought vengeance, or cowered in fear. The Marai paused, her head tilting. The chorus inside her demanded she stop, that she enter, that she give him the same cold they had all received. No, a new voice said. It was her voice, but changed, flat, cold, and final. It was the first time she had spoken with their combined power. He is just one. We are for the many. The vow was made. She was not a ghost of vengeance. She was a vessel of memory. She would walk the world, a living monument to their pain. She would be the witness they were all denied. She moved through the house, a shadow that the other shadows made way for. She reached the front door and opened it. The night air hit her. It was cold, but it was living cold. It smelled of pine and damp earth. She stepped out onto the gravel path, the moon painting her in strokes of silver and blue. She had survived, but the person who walked out of that house was not the person who had been dragged in. The scars were not on her skin. They were her skin. The mental scars were not trauma. They were her entire consciousness. She was a mosaic of the dead, a new entity born from a covenant of despair. She looked down at her hands. They were pale, thin, and they trembled. Not from fear, not from cold. They trembled with the contained, pressurized energy of 100 stolen lives. The girl was gone, lost in the whisper pact, shattered in the mirror without reflection. She had barely survived the transformation. The Marai had been born, and as she took her first step away from the house, a single, cold tear tracked down her alien cheek. It was not her tear. It was the last tear of the forgotten, and it froze before it ever hit the ground. The death of Abigail Cole was not an end. It was a catalyst. In the decades that followed, the house on the hill became a place of whispers, a vessel for an echo that refused to fade. Families came and went, driven away not by violence, but by the oppressive, lingering weight of sorrow. They spoke of a coldness that no fire could touch, of a scent like damp earth and lilies after a storm. When David and Marianne moved in, they were warned. They dismissed the warnings as rural superstition. They were pragmatic, modern people. They loved the old hardwood floors, the grand staircase, the misty views of the lake below. Then, the phenomena began. It started subtly. Doors they had closed would be found ajar. A cold draft would snake through the hallway on a perfectly still summer night. But after the first month, the house's memory began to sharpen. The haunting coalesced, taking on a specific, ritualistic, and terrifying pattern. It was no longer just a haunted house. It was a story demanding to be heard. Wet footprints, the first undeniable event, happened during a dry spell in August. Marianne came downstairs for a glass of water, the midnight air thick and silent. She stopped at the bottom of the stairs. There, glistening on the dark, polished wood of the foyer, was a set of footprints. They were small, slender, and perfectly formed, as if a barefoot woman had just stepped in from a rainstorm. But it had not rained in weeks. They started at the front door, which was locked, and led toward the living room, stopping at the grand piano. What terrified Marianne was not just their presence, but their substance. They were not water. They were a thin, silty, grey mud, carrying the unmistakable metallic scent of the deep lake. She followed them, her heart a cold stone in her chest. The trail stopped, and the air around the piano bench dropped 20 degrees. She fled back to the bedroom, waking David. By the time they returned, the footprints were gone, but the smell of the lake lingered for days. The footprints became a regular occurrence, a chilling calling card left only on the driest of nights, a saturated stain of an event that refused to dry. Claire de Lune, at 2:47 a.m. The second sign was the music. The piano was hopelessly out of tune, a relic David had promised to have restored. Its keys were yellowed, and one of the high Cs was dead. At 2:45 a.m. on a Tuesday, they were both startled awake. A melody was drifting up from the living room. It was faint, tinny, and yet exquisitely played. Debussy's Claire de Lune. David grabbed a fireplace poker, and they crept down the stairs. The music was clear, each note resonating with a profound, aching sadness. As they reached the landing, the melody swelled, hitting the famous, gentle crescendo. They burst into the room. Silence. The living room was empty, illuminated only by the pale moonlight streaming through the windows. The piano lid was closed. The air was still. David checked his phone for the time. 2:47 a.m. The music returned every few nights. Always the same song, always ending at the exact same moment. It was a memory imprinted on the air itself, a fragment of a soul stuck in a loop. They buried me, but I still remember the house was suffocating them. Marianne, consumed by a strange mixture of terror and empathy, became obsessed. This was not a monster. This was a tragedy. She's trying to tell us something, she insisted to David, who was already calling real estate agents. Driven by this conviction, Marianne began to tear the house apart, not to renovate, but to excavate. In the attic, tucked beneath a loose floorboard under a heavy, cedar-lined trousseau, she found it, a small velvet-bound diary, its clasp rusted shut. The lock broke away with a dry snap. The first entry was dated April 1923. The handwriting was elegant, feminine. It belonged to Abigail Cole. The backstory began to unspool. Abigail was the young, second wife of a wealthy, older industrialist, Robert Vance. He had built this house for her. The early entries were filled with hope, with love for the house, the lake, and her piano. Robert has given me the most wonderful gift, a new Steinway. When I play, I feel the music fills every corner of this house, that the walls themselves are listening. Claire de Lune is my favourite. It is the colour of the lake at dusk. As the months wore on, the tone shifted. The ink became darker, the script more hurried. Robert was cold, distant. He was travelling to the city more often, his explanations vague. August 10th, there is a new maid, Alice. She is young, pretty. I see the way Robert looks at her, Or perhaps, I imagine it, this house is so isolated. The silence here can play tricks on a lonely mind. September 2nd. I'm not imagining it. I found a pearl earring, not mine, in his coat pocket. When I confronted him, he laughed. He told me I was becoming hysterical. He said this house, this morbid quiet, was rotting my brain. The final entries were a frantic spiral of paranoia and certainty. October 4th. Alice is gone. Robert sent her away. He said it was to give me peace of mind. But I saw him give her money. I saw them by the boathouse. He held her. He has never held me like that. Not in a long time. And then, the last entry, it was dated October 19th, 1923. He knows that I know. He returned from the city tonight, his eyes like ice. He found the letters I had packed. He is in the study, drinking. I can hear him. I am in the living room. I am playing. The music is the only thing that calms me. The storm is terrible tonight. The lake is lashing the shore, but the piano is my only friend. It is 2:45 a.m. He is coming. The diary ended there. Marianne and David took the diary to the Town Historical Society, a dusty room run by a man named Mr. Henderson. He was old, with eyes that had seen the town's entire history. He listened to their story, his fingers steepled, and read the final diary entry. He nodded slowly. Abigail Cole, he said, his voice a dry rustle. The reveal. Yes, I thought this story was buried for good. Mistress Henderson went to a back room and returned with a heavy, string-bound ledger, the county coroner, and police reports for 1923. He opened it to October 20th. Abigail Cole, deceased, cause of death, accidental drowning. Accident, Mariam whispered. That was the official story. Mr. Henderson said, pushing a second, thinner file toward them. This one was sealed. Unofficial police investigation, never released. Inside was a single typed sheet, a detective's notes. Robert Vance claimed he had been asleep. He said Abigail, in her hysterical state, must have wandered out into the storm and slipped from the boathouse dock. But the detective had noted inconsistencies. Mr. Vance's pajamas were perfectly dry. Mr. Henderson read, yet his boots, left by the door, were caked in fresh, wet mud, the same mud from the lake's edge. There was a trail of it, he noted, from the front door to the study, and then to the living room. Robert claimed he had gone out looking for her after he woke up and found her missing, but the footprints were already there. Marianne's blood ran cold. The wet footprints, she breathed. Indeed, Mr. Henderson said. But the most damning part was this. The phonograph in the study. The detective noted a record was still on the turntable. Debussy. Robert had claimed it was playing when he went to bed, to calm his wife's nerves. But the coroner, he gave the time of death, based on water temperature and lividity, as approximately 2:45 a.m. to 3:00 a.m. 2:47 a.m. The exact moment the music always stopped. Robert inherited everything. Mr. Henderson concluded. He sold the house a month later. He married the maid, Alice, the following year. They moved to Chicago. The story was buried. Officially. Abigail Cole died in accident. A hysterical woman who slipped in the rain. All earlier clues now make sense. David and Marianne drove home in a heavy, sickened silence. They entered the house, but it was no longer their house. It was Abigail's. The clues were not random. They were an accusation. They were the story of her last moments, played out for eternity. The backstory was the betrayal. The reveal was the murder. The haunting was the memory. The wet footprints were not Abigail's. They were Robert's, tracked in from the lake after he had held her under the black water, the mud of the bank clinging to his boots. He had brought the lake into the house. The Clair de Lune at 2:47 a.m. was not a ghost playing the piano. It was the echo of the phonograph record in the study, the last sound she heard, the melody that played as she was being dragged from her piano bench. It was the soundtrack to her murder, skipping at the exact second her life was extinguished. The cold, the sorrow, the overpowering scent of lilies and damp earth. It was the smell of the funeral, of the lies, of a body pulled from the water. They buried me, but I still remember. They had buried her, yes, but they had also buried the truth. And Abigail, or whatever imprint she had left on the very bones of the house, could not rest until that truth was unearthed. That night, they did not sleep. They sat in the dark living room, the open diary on the coffee table, the clock on the mantel ticked toward the inevitable. 2:40 a.m. The air began to chill. 2:44 a.m. The scent of lake water and mildew rose from the floorboards. 2:45 a.m. The first, faint, tinny notes of Clair de Lune began to play. The music swelled louder this time, filled with a resonant, amplified rage. It was no longer just an echo, it was a presence. 2:47 a.m. The music stopped. Silence. Marianne let out a shaky breath, but the silence did not last. From the piano, a single discordant clang rang out, one of the dead keys. Then another, and another, a new sound. Slow, heavy, sodden footsteps were crossing the foyer, not the small, delicate footprints of before. These were heavy, a man's boot. Thud, squish, thud, squish. The footsteps of Robert Vance, returning from the lake, were joining the echo. The haunting was changing. It was no longer just her memory. It was his, too. What do you think? After following Chloe's discovery of that bloodstained journal, what does it truly mean to say her name, to remember someone whose society tried so hard to erase? This story is a powerful reminder of a specific kind of cultural and spiritual weight. In many societies, diseases like Hansen's disease weren't just a medical diagnosis, they were a social execution. It was seen as a stain on family honor, a curse that could condemn an entire bloodline. These people weren't just isolated, they were erased. Their names were struck from records, their graves left unmarked. This is the core of so many restless spirits in folklore, not a thirst for vengeance, but a desperate need for their story, their truth, to finally be returned. They just want their name back. What are your theories on the journal and what Chloe should do next? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And if you want to make sure you don't miss the next time we dig into the shadows, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. There are many more names waiting to be said.